Well, it's been a tumultuous year, 2019, and we can expect 2020 to be pretty much the same. But for most Venezuelans, the biggest issue this new year has got to be the economy. The Venezuelan economy continues to struggle. We are now into our sixth consecutive year of recession, and it's estimated that the GDP has shrunk to about 25% of what it was in 2014. So the main challenge facing everyday life here in Venezuela is inflation, is the disparities between wages and prices, and this is going to be the main challenge which faces the government in 2020. If they're able to sort the economy out this year and bring some sort of stability to the economic situation, then obviously they'll win a lot of supporters back to their camp. But if the economy continues to collapse, as it has done in the last few years, then it's really going to up the pressure on the opposition and on the government to find an alternative solution for the country.
Great. So what does the situation look like on the ground for ordinary Venezuelans right now?
This is a very important question, and it's very key to understanding what's going on here in Venezuela, that we challenge the narrative that you read in the mainstream press. I'm sure all of you have read about the shortages here in Venezuela, no? We have to contextualize this. About 4 to 5 years ago, there were rampant shortages in most sectors of the economy and the day-to-day goods which Venezuelans would buy. However, today, in 2019, 2020, the situation has changed completely. It would be fair to say on a national scale that in the food sector, it's about 95 to 97% supply at the moment, which means the shortages are down to less than 5% in the food sector. In the medical sector and the drug sector, the basic medicines are in free supply, easily found, but the top level medicines are subject to certain levels of shortages. No? In things like repair parts for vehicles, machinery, things like this, there is a level of shortages, but it is massively decreased from what it was a few years ago. So when you read in Reuters or you read in the Associated Press about the shortages here in Venezuela, this is either outdated reporting, trying to paint a picture of something which doesn't exist here in the reality, or it's basically just wrong, okay? So the shortages are much better than they were before. The main problem now facing Venezuelans is a disparity between their income and their costs. No? The wages are not high enough to live at the same quality of life as we were used to here 5 or 10 years ago. For many Venezuelans on a basic wage, including public employees, minimum wage earners, and so on, they have to find a second or a third or even a fourth job to be able to survive. And this is on a decreased quality of life from what they're used to. Many Venezuelans have had to look for alternative sources of income, including some extra legal activities to be able to feed their families. But this is, again, not a problem about shortages, it's a problem about the wages and the cost disparities. No? And the other major issue which we have to talk about here when answering this question is about the public services. Obviously, after 6 years of recession, the public spending on services has decreased massively. It was inevitable that public spending was going to be hit by the economic crisis, and this is really starting to kick in now. We're seeing telephone networks collapsing, we're seeing internet connections collapsing, we're seeing roadways increasingly deteriorated, rubbish collection, water supply, electricity supply, all suffering a lack of investment from the authorities. Now, this is, of course, combined with other factors which have hit these sectors, including corruption, including stealing of parts, including a brain drain due to migration and other factors. But the number one factor is a lack of investment from the government in the public services. And this is now the number one motivating factor for Venezuelans who choose to migrate, who choose to set up camp in another country, is this. The frustrating nature of day-to-day life when you don't have a reliable electricity connection, water supply, telephone network, internet connection, and a whole range of other services.
Okay, so kind of on that topic though of the U.S. media and how they get things wrong, the U.S. media is reporting on Guaido again, the narrative is that he was barred from entering the National Assembly amid a socialist takeover of the judicial body. How are Venezuelans reacting to this recent incident? And is it a rallying point for the opposition? What is the US media getting wrong? And will the US be able to use this as justification next time they want to escalate tensions with Venezuela?
Well, as is usual, the US media got quite a lot wrong with this story. Firstly, the new leadership of the National Assembly, which replaced Juan Guaido, is definitely not socialist. The leader of the National Assembly, Luis Parra, belongs to a party belonging to the hard right of the political spectrum, called Mer Justicia. It's in fact the political party of ex-presidential candidate Enrique Capriles, who some of you may have heard of. So definitely no socialist takeover of the National Assembly. The pro-government bloc is still in the vast minority. About 30% of the deputies are socialists, and the other 70% are right-wingers. This hasn't changed. What we have seen is a massive division, a fraction within the opposition ranks. And this is something which the press are very reluctant to report on, obviously because it's not in their political interests here in Venezuela. We've seen a section of the opposition side with Juan Guaido and through him, obviously, the Washington-led rallying call in the region. But we've also seen a section of the opposition rebel from this and say, we don't agree with the government, but we're going to play within the rules of the game. We're going to play by the constitutional rules of the country, the democratic rules of the country, and we're going to try and bring about change according to our political opinion through amassing support in the people rather than trying to topple a government through regime change and coup d'etats. No? And this fraction within the opposition has of course benefited the government. This is where the socialist takeover narrative comes in. We're seeing a group of the opposition who are willing to talk to the government, who are willing to discuss with the socialist deputies about law changes, constitutional changes, electoral guarantees, and so on. This doesn't make them socialists. It means that they're willing to sit down with the socialists and talk about these issues. And this is something which has brought a great amount of upheaval to the state structure, we can say, over the last month. Now, how are Venezuelans responding to this? Well, to be honest with you, most Venezuelans are sick and tired of the political games played by both the government and the opposition sectors. Most Venezuelans are more concerned with getting food on their plates, surviving this economic crisis, trying to come out the other side, and they're looking for solutions. They're not looking for political gameplays, they're not looking for political quarterbacks, they're looking for economic solutions for the country. And anyone who's willing to actually provide a constructive way forward for the economy is potentially able to harness a lot of popular support at the moment, be it the government or the opposition.
So also kind of with the US in mind, we're rapidly approaching, it seemed like a week ago, and it still does, that we're rapidly approaching another war in the Middle East. As a journalist that produces content about a similarly demonized country, can you talk about the common tropes Western media uses to foment conflict in the global South? What is the overlap of Venezuela and Iran?
Well, the first point I wanted to make clear here is that there are massive material differences between Iran and Venezuela. Anyone who clumps the two into the same group is really showing some sort of ignorance, both in terms of the political situation, the popular support, the material on the ground conditions, the military, a whole range of factors now. But we can, at some point, draw some sort of common thread when we look at the media coverage, as you point out. The coverage by the mainstream media, not just the US media, the Canadian media, the British media, most of the European media, the mainstream coverage uses word association, uses phrases out of context to try to demonize both countries, obviously to justify some sort of action in the future. It's very hard for the Pentagon to justify military action or even harsh economic action against another foreign government, unless there is some sort of popular support in the United States and in the rest of the global North countries, albeit a minority support, but some sort of popular support. So they need to generate this. They need to generate this by convincing a certain amount of the population, we could say a certain ignorant amount of the population, that an elected leader is a dictator. that a country which has arrested more drug lords than any other country in the last few years is in fact supporting drug running. No? These sort of word plays, word associations, so the psycho networks which really generate at some point subconscious or unconscious associations in the future. When you start seeing in the mainstream press that so-and-so is a dictator, so time and time again, you start to forget the fact that so-and-so was actually electorally voted in by a majority of the population in what has been declared a free and fair election. But once you see the word dictator time and time again, it suddenly doesn't start to become a surprise when you see the threats of military action, the threats of economic sanctions, because this is supposedly justified for dictatorships. This is the way that the media really plays an integral part in the establishment and the state apparatus, and in all of the future actions we've seen taken to the extreme in places like Afghanistan and Iraq. It's very interesting to play back the analysis of what happened in the lead up to both Iraq wars and see where it really started. And it really started with a media demonization campaign of not just the leaders, but also the government and the country, the people. The idea that an Iraqi life wasn't worth the same as an American life, that Iraqi family didn't have the same day-to-day problems as an American family. And all of these issues, based on hypocrisy, based on arrogance, based on racism, and a whole range of other issues, are part of building blocks in creating this sort of idea that some sort of intervention against this country is okay, is justified. The fact that it goes against international law is okay because, you know, they're from the global south. Their lives aren't worth so much. And this is where the media comes into play in the imperialist war machine, which is much more obviously seen by so many people across the world.
Awesome, thank you. I think, did you have a couple questions you wanted to ask Candy? Okay, so Candy's going to ask a couple questions.
Hey, Paul, I was wondering if you could kind of paint a picture of what a Venezuelan would go through, like just on a day-by-day basis, and how the sanctions would affect them from like the moment that they woke up, from when they tried to get to work. You've written particularly on the access to petrol, to gas, on Venezuela Analysis. And so could you kind of help everybody here kind of put themselves in the shoes of an average Venezuelan?
Well, you mentioned one of the key words which we obviously couldn't finish today's discussion without talking about: the sanctions, the blockade. I prefer to call it a blockade because sanctions kind of sounds like we've done something wrong. You sanction, you punish your child because they've done something wrong, in your opinion. According to the American law, or the American way of the Trump administration, I should say, the Venezuelans have done something wrong and have therefore been sanctioned. But we have to question this. Here in Venezuela, the sanctions have had a particular impact, a strange impact. Maybe not the impact that we expected. This blockade, this wide-reaching blockade. The blockade is largely based on threats. You know, there are threats of secondary sanctions against foreign firms doing trading or dealings with any government entity in Venezuela. But this isn't an automatic process. You know? Since the blockade was really expanded in August, we've seen very few sanctions actually applied against Venezuela in terms of the remit which they were given. We've seen individual sanctions against political leaders, and so on. But in terms of the extent to which we expected to see this blockade applied, we've not seen anything of this sort of scale. The one industry which has been hardest hit by this blockade has been the oil industry, which is why I focus a lot of my reporting on the fuel situation here in Venezuela. The oil industry has been hit because the US have applied sanctions against any international firm which looks to rent out a oil tanker to either bring fuel into Venezuela or export crude from Venezuela to another country. This has basically caused a bottleneck in the Venezuelan oil industry. The oil deposits, the crude deposits here in Venezuela are full of crude oil which can't be processed and can't be taken to the pumps because we're not allowed to import the important diluents needed to process this into fuel for our cars. You know? This has had a massive impact on the Venezuelan fuel situation. Across the country, the picture varies, but in its worst situation, people have to queue to 5 to 7 days, day and night, to fill their cars or their motorbikes with fuel. And this is a direct impact of the blockade announced by Donald Trump, first in January and then expanded in August. You know? Apart from the situation of the fuel, the other main area which has been hit by the blockade has been medicine. Despite an alleged loophole to continue the imports of drugs into Venezuela, this essentially hasn't happened. And the deterrence of the blockade, or a potential blockade, has scared off a lot of commercial partners of the Venezuelan state, particularly in Brazil and in India. This has meant that it's been increasingly difficult and expensive for the Venezuelan authorities and the private sector as well to import drugs into the country, top-level drugs. Venezuela produces a lot of the basic drugs which we need here, but anything medium and top-level drugs has to be imported, which means everything has to go through foreign bank accounts, which have been frozen, has to go through international shipping firms, which are reluctant to work with Venezuela for risk of being sanctioned, and so on and so on. And this is something which has really impacted and really hit the heart of the issue of the blockade. So for an average Venezuelan, when they go out onto the streets to buy their groceries, when they go to work, they won't necessarily see the impact of the blockade. Where they might see it on their day-to-day business is in the cost of the bus fare, which has shot up given the shortages of fuel, where they start seeing imported repair parts for vehicles increasingly scarce. But generally in the day-to-day situation, they won't see the impact of this blockade. So this is one of the main campaigns from the government here to try to inform the general population about the impact of the blockade, which often happens at a much higher level. You know, government payments being blocked in bank accounts, difficulties finding shipping firms, these sorts of issues, which is not necessarily on the day-to-day life of most of us here. And this is, of course, in the interest of those who are implementing the blockade.
I'm interested. Can you talk a little bit more about the psychological impacts of this idea of scarcity scarcity amongst abundance? Because there's plenty of money in Venezuela, right? But the whole point of the blockade is, to make life so miserable that people, they might feel impulse to rebel. So could you talk a little bit about that?
The wealth gap in Venezuela, including especially I should say, over the last 10 years or even 20 years, the Bolivarian period has increased. This is probably something most of you didn't know. The wealth gap has increased. The rich in Venezuela are richer than they have ever been, and the poor in Venezuela, especially over the last 4 to 5 years, are poorer. It's very common here in Venezuela to go to a top-end restaurant on a Saturday night where they charge you in dollars, and it'll be absolutely packed full. There'll be a queue of people waiting to get into the restaurant. No? Obviously not normal people, the rich people who have dollar income, who have businesses in Miami, who have huge industrial complexes here in Venezuela. But there is plenty of money in the streets in Venezuela. No? The problem is it's not that well distributed. No? These social programs implemented by the government, which look to readdress this, obviously had a very important impact leading up to around 2013, 2014. But due to the economic situation, there have had to be cuts in these programs. This was to some extent inevitable, as I mentioned, talking about the public services. But we could also apply this to the social benefits. The government are making a strong effort to try to limit these cuts as best they can, but cuts are inevitable. So we can really see that for the average Venezuelan, the poor or even lower middle class Venezuelan, situation, the living standard is much worse than it was before. And this, of course, has had a massive psychological impact. This has led to most Venezuelans I should rather say, this has been the main motivating factor for those Venezuelans who have decided to emigrate. No? For those who have emigrated, the total figure of the immigration is a little bit cloudy, but for those who have emigrated, there is a significant percentage who have come from the middle classes or upper middle classes. These people haven't emigrated through hunger, through necessity, because there are political persecutions. They've emigrated because their quality of life they were used to under the early Chavez years has dropped. Their wage, which they could previously use to go on holiday every month, to go to expensive restaurants every week and so on, now isn't enough to do this. No? And this has led them to look for the same quality of life in other countries, mostly across the continent. But for those who have decided to stay, the psychological impact of this economic crisis has been devastating. We've seen a massive increase in political apathy. We've seen a drop in levels of popular organization in the majority of the country, because people simply do not have time to dedicate to political building, to their communal council, to their commune, to their women's group, because they're now working 3 or 4 jobs. No? There are exceptions to this. Some of the major communes here in Venezuela have actually seen an increase in political participation through the crisis, as people are looking for a solution, a collective solution, to try to keep their heads above water. But the general rule has been that people have dropped their levels of participation, which is very worrying for the long-term future of the political process here in Venezuela and for socialism itself.
I just want to say, I like the way that you said that. They're not normal people, they're rich people. I was recently listening to Glenn Greenwald on a podcast say that, for those of you who don't know, Glenn Greenwald's a lawyer turned journalist, and he moved to Brazil, and he now lives there full time with his husband. He writes a lot about Bolsonaro and stuff. His life has been threatened as a result of that. He's openly gay, kind of doing this anti-fascist organizing. Anyway, he said that one of the things that he noticed moving from the U.S. to Brazil is that, you know, Brazil's it's a relevant country. It's the 5th most populous country in the world in terms of trade and international economics. It's a really important country, but politicians never talk about which country they're going to invade next and whether or not to kill folks overseas and stuff like that. And so I was curious, you're European, and as somebody currently living in the United States, what's it like to live in a country that isn't always talking about killing other people overseas?
No, but there are plenty of talk going on here in Venezuela about the other governments who are talking about that. Rest assured, there's plenty of media coverage dedicated to the imperialist war machine here in Venezuela. No? But no, this is one of the strange things of living in a country like this. I for example, as a student back in Scotland, was very active in the Palestine Solidarity campaign, and when I came here to Venezuela, I looked for the Venezuelan Palestine Solidarity campaign, and I couldn't find one. And somebody said to me, but here the government's in solidarity. We don't need any campaign to convince the government to be in solidarity with Palestine, because they already are. No? So here we're very much on the other side of the coin. We're not looking to necessarily pressure a right-wing government into assuming the sort of policies which the people want, but we're more looking to construct. We're looking to see how we can make things actually work, how the problems which arise once political power has been assumed by, let's say, a party closer to the people, by a party which isn't dominated necessarily by profits. This isn't simple. This is an extremely complex situation, and in fact much more complex than any sort of anti-political organization which you find in most of Europe and the United States, against the government, against the Iraq war, against the political persecution, against all of these issues. Here we're looking to actually construct. And the number of issues which come out of this process are immense. Hugo Chavez once said it, for every problem you solve, 5 more develop. And this is true. And it really has to change the way that you look at things. You have to change your mental chip, we can say, in your head to start working to build something rather than to tear something down. And this isn't easy at all. The issues which have arisen, things like corruption, things like brain drain, things like the media manipulation, and all of these sort of issues have forced us to reassess and to innovate to some extent, to find solutions or at least try to move forward in finding solutions to the new problems which the opposing forces, the forces of the right, the forces of big business, the forces of imperialism, present to us nearly on a daily basis.
That's extraordinary. This is part of the reason, if I can speak personally, why we work on Venezuela, is that it presents to us a possibility for a future where we do things like that, right? Instead of fighting all the time against our government, we're creating, right? We're problem solving. Because the fact of the matter is, and if we had socialism tomorrow, like, would anybody in this room know what to do? If you just all of a sudden were in charge, you're like, oh shit, I didn't even think about that. I'm so busy. I'm so busy rallying so we don't invade another country.
Exactly.
Yeah. So thanks, Paul. I think we're gonna. Did you have anything else?
If we want to put it out to the audience, and I can follow up after that, if anybody has any questions they'd like to ask.
Yeah.
And as far as that, the United States is currently sanctioning specifically Venezuela's food program, which they've had Venezuela has had a food program for the people for years. The United States government is now trying to sanction that. Wanting to know a little more about what's happening with that.
Yeah, so the question was, there are food programs in Venezuela.
The Venezuelan government has a food program a food program, basically a national food program,
right,
by the Venezuelan government. It's been going on for years, but basically the United States government has just decided to sanction specifically that food program.
So if you could talk a little bit about how the sanctions have impacted the Venezuelan food program, the food distribution program.
Sure. The food distribution program set up by the government was directly looking to solve problems of disnutrition created by the economic situation that we have in this country. And this has been one of the areas, here we call it the CLAP program, which stands for the Local Committees of Production, Food Production. And this is a community organized program, which is basically about getting a massively subsidized box or bag of food on a regular basis, once a month, once every 2 months, depending on your locality. The subsidy for this program is above 95%, so it's essentially free. It's ridiculously cheap when you get this. This has been one of the programs which has been targeted by the Trump administration and their blockade. It sounds horrendous, but it's true. Most of the products which come in this CLAP box or the CLAP bag are imported. Contradictorily, the idea behind this program was that it would stimulate local production and the distribution of locally produced goods. This hasn't happened. This hasn't happened at all. Nearly everything that arrives in this program is imported from strategic allies: Mexico, Turkey, Russia, and so on. How has this been impacted by that blockade? The same way that anything else which is imported in Venezuela has been impacted by the blockade, through the targeting of the transport distribution networks and the payments of these goods. Let me give you a micro example. The Venezuelan government signs a contract with, let's say, Mexico to import 20 containers of rice, which will go into the CLAP program. They have to pay for this. How do they pay for this? Any international payment has to go through an international bank. Who controls the vast majority of the international financial infrastructure? Washington. If Washington decides to block this payment, delay this payment, put on extra tariffs on this payment between Mexico and Venezuela, they can do so through Citibank, through Bank of America, through MasterCard, through Visa, through all of these financial institutions based in the United States. The other way they can do this is looking to target the shipping firms. If Venezuela can sign this contract, purchase a good, pay for them even, they have to get them into Venezuela. Venezuela has almost no national shipping firms, which means they rely on other regional partners. Shipping firms have got a massive monopoly concentration in the hands of a few massive firms which control the waters, control the seas. If these firms are scared from doing business with Venezuela because of the sanctions, the embargo, the blockade, then this becomes increasingly difficult for Venezuela to actually get these products into the country. No? So this is how the blockade has really hit this program. Nonetheless, through some very respectful and interesting international relations set up by the Venezuelan Foreign Office, they have managed to bypass these at the moment. The CLAP program has expanded over the last 4 to 5 years in Venezuela. It's now estimated that around 6 million people benefit from this program. But it should be pointed out, as I did at the beginning, the frequency with which this program arrives depends on your locality. If you live in a right-wing sector, you'll probably receive this benefit with much less frequency than if you live in a shanty town in a government supporting sector. But it also has something to do with levels of local corruption, of local efficiency, of local government policies, and a whole range of other factors. No? There is, just to finalize on this question, there is an even more interesting program, at least from my perspective, which are the programs which are starting to develop through the communes. These are completely autonomous food subsidized programs, autonomous from the government infrastructure, autonomous from the government corruption, government bureaucracy, legislation, and so on, which are basically focused around bartering or exchange of goods between different communes, different communities. One community produces cheese, and they exchange this cheese with a different community which produces clothes or rice or coffee or a different good which is in requirement. You know? These sort of programs are increasing. They're obviously massively limited still because of the level of popular organization in the communes, but between the communes in the country which are best organized, these programs are increasing. And this is providing a new alternative model which has at times even threatened the ruling party's model of top-down subsidized food programs based on dependence on the government, with more autonomous, more people power-based programs based on local production rather than importing, and obviously the safeguards which go with it in terms of currency controls and so on and so on. So I would recommend anyone who's interested in this sort of issue to look up things like the Pueblo a Pueblo food exchange system here in Venezuela. Venezuela Analysis has just brought out a very interesting new video, the first part of a new series of videos based on this, on the communal exchanges and the communal response to the economic crisis here in Venezuela. And again, this is something which is challenging the traditional political bureaucratic model which is currently dominated by the Socialist Party.
Yeah, this is Dan Shea. Good to see you, Paul. One of the
Hey Dan, how are you?
pretty good. One of the things that was happening when I was there was also urban farming that was beginning to start up, taking the Cuban model to work on food security. But when you also mentioned the idea of these delegations coming there, we're curious about how people with the blockade, with the sanctions, how people can travel to Venezuela. What kind of difficulty are people having to come and see for themselves?
For American citizens, it's difficult now. I mean, you're both aware of that. You remember your visit here last year, the problems you faced getting visas, getting flights. The blockade has extended to flights. There are almost no American carriers now running direct flights to Venezuela. Due to the break of diplomatic relations, there are obviously no Venezuelan embassies or consulates working in the United States, so any sort of visas which are going to be emitted now have to go through Canada, creating bureaucratic problems and time delays. But beyond that, very few problems at all. I would in fact encourage everyone who's at your event tonight to come to Venezuela. Come and see for yourself. Don't even take my word for what the reality on the ground here is. Come and see for yourself. And I'm pretty sure, as you did, Dan, you'll go back with an entirely different opinion from maybe the one which you've seen in the press, even some of the more centrist press and media outlets about Venezuela. What you'll learn from being here in Venezuela and seeing for yourself is worth much more than reading books and news articles on the web about Venezuela. No, as American citizens, you were and you would be again if you came here. You would be greeted with open arms. As soon as you tell everyone that you didn't vote for Trump, then you'll be greeted with open arms. And the Venezuelans have a massive amount of solidarity with the North American pressure campaigns. People here are very aware about what's going on in the United States, about the issues which are important to you in the United States as well, the race issue, the economic problems you have, the homeless problems you have in the United States. People here in Venezuela are massively aware of the campaigns you run in favor of peace in Venezuela. What happened in the US Embassy last year, the upcoming trial this year of the activists who were left in the embassy. These are all issues which are covered here in Venezuela extensively. So there are no cultural barriers for you to come to Venezuela and see yourself what is going on. In fact, next week, there is a huge anti-imperialist gathering here in Venezuela. I don't have the exact figure, but there will be thousands of people across the world in Caracas next Wednesday, Thursday, and Friday for an international anti-imperialist gathering, which will look to examine the nature of imperialism, not just in Venezuela, but across the world, and what we can do as a people to combat this. No? So this is a very important element, and as is the organisation and the work that you do there in Portland. Please don't ever lose sight of the fact that your work isn't going ignored, that you're not shooting into a barrel. The work that you're doing is important, and here in Venezuela, people are aware of it, and it inspires us. It makes us feel that we're part of something much bigger, and that there are people in the United States challenging the government line. This is from the work against the media lies which are spread about Venezuela, no? From both the left and the right-wing press. Very important to challenge everything you see written about Venezuela. No? So please take this message out to the rest of the people in the Portland hands of Venezuela, because this is something which I hear every day here in Venezuela, the importance of keeping up the international solidarity movement. Maybe not necessarily with the Venezuelan government, maybe you have differences, but with the Venezuelan people, with the anti-imperialist struggle of the Venezuelan people, which is alive and kicking still.
Thank you.
Hey, Paul. My name is Mike Hasty. I'm a friend of Dan. I'm a member of Veterans for Peace, also Vietnam veteran. And the reason I say that is I know what the American Empire did to the Vietnamese people. There was not one day during the Vietnam War where the United States did not commit an atrocity. Okay, that's very important for the American people to know. My thing is there a move in Venezuela and certainly other countries that to become more independent, because globalization is strangling countries like Venezuela, because empires can control everything. So is there a move for Venezuelans to become more self-sufficient? You know, let's say an example would be like, okay, let's say they manufacture an automobile. All the parts are made in Venezuela, so you don't have to have these parts shipped in. Because it seems like you're a sitting duck for globalization when all these goods and services have to come to Venezuela.
Yeah, this is very interesting. We first saw in Venezuela these sort of issues enter the national discourse with Hugo Chavez. No? Hugo Chavez around 2006-07 started to talk about the need to become self-sufficient economically, productivity, in terms of food, medicine, everything basically. there was a push towards this in 2006, 2007 onwards. Around 2013, 2014, when we saw the economic crisis really start to kick in here, unfortunately we saw that a lot of what was in the discourse of Chavez at the time had not been translated into effective policies, mostly by the ministerial teams, by the local government, and so on. But we were no closer to self-sufficiently in 2014 than we were in 1999, essentially. Given the extent of the current economic crisis, because unless any of you have lived through 6 years of continuous recession, it's very difficult to actually explain the extent of 6 years of economic recession for a country. Given this, we are now starting to see, hopefully, a more concentrated and effective move towards self-sufficiency. The issue has returned, obviously, to the public discourse of Nicolas Maduro very quickly after the economic crisis started to kick in. And the extent to which this has now been translated into effective policies, we're still waiting to see. Hopefully, the current government would have learned the lesson from the mistakes of the Chavez era in this respect, and will actually be doing something more concretely. But there are definitely government initiatives, at least programs, we could say, to move towards, or rather to break with international financial infrastructures such as Visa. There is a program to break with Visa and set up a Venezuelan or a regional card transaction payment system which doesn't depend on the financial infrastructure of these financial giants. We've also seen efforts to try to retake control of areas including the food production, internal transport, and things like this. But they have been limited so far. Another good example is a question of the fuel production. As I explained before, to process crude oil, which Venezuela has plenty of, into fuel cars, you need to add a certain number of chemicals. It's a process. One of the key chemicals is a diluent, which is needed. This diluent is currently produced by Citgo. Since Citgo was taken out of Venezuela or the national government's hands and essentially expropriated by Trump and his people, Venezuela now doesn't have access to this diluent. The obvious comment following this analysis would be, why isn't the government setting up factories here in Venezuela to start producing this diluent so we can start processing our own crude oil and supplying our petrol stations or our gas pumps, as you would say, without the necessity of bringing things in from the outside? This hasn't happened. The response of the current government has been in this field to replace dependency on Venezuelan assets in the United States with a dependency on the Chinese National Petroleum Corporation, or with Rosneft, or with a whole range of other international multinational companies, none of which are Venezuelan. This is one of the major criticisms which is coming at the government at the moment from the left-wing sectors, from the grassroots revolutionaries. They have to some extent replaced import dependency, not just in these sectors, but in a whole range of other issues, medicines, drugs, food, processing parts, and so on, replaced an import dependency with a different import dependency. But the model is the same. Very few sectors could be identified where there has been a genuine, concrete, touchable move forward to self-sufficiency and connecting the productive chain. And this is something which, at least in my opinion, the government really have to start working towards, because there's no good having 80% of a productive chain of a good based here in Venezuela if the 10-20% which is missing still has to come from outside. This is what is happening, for example, in the agricultural sector. Where I live is the largest agricultural sector in Venezuela, the state of Merida. A lot of the goods which are used in agriculture are now produced nationally, but the seeds are still imported. And anything that is imported not in the immediate, not necessarily just in the immediate term, but in the medium and long term solutions for the economy as well.
Is there a woman that has a question? Any chance? For a councilman in here. Okay. What's your question?
Hi, thank you for speaking. This has been really interesting.
Hi.
You spoke a bit about American citizens coming to Venezuela, as well as the importance of continuing to protest with hands off Venezuela. But I was wondering if there were any other actions we could be taking as American citizens concerned with these issues. Groups that we could be promoting or donating towards, things like that.
I think that the best things you guys can do as American citizens, in my humble opinion, would be to get Trump out of the White House. It's not that easy, I know, but that would help. That would help a lot. But no, beyond that, there is a range of things. I think. It's obviously you have to evaluate, but challenging the media is very important. Not just the mainstream press, but it's very important also to challenge what the Venezuelan government are saying. The Venezuelan government are involved in a propaganda war with imperialism. This is natural, but this also leads to them at times exaggerating things, unveiling a host of policies without any sort of real content to them. No. So we have to challenge everything we see about Venezuela, even challenge what I'm telling you about Venezuela. Come and see for yourself. I would invite you to do this, no? But especially the US press, which is infamous for its manipulation, its downright lies about what's going on. Very important to try to challenge this from the United States. Equally, there's a whole range of sources you can use here in Venezuela to inform yourself. Obviously, Venezuela Analysis is one. There are other English language sites up and around as well. And if you speak Spanish, obviously you have the advantage of being able to access a whole range more of materials. If you have any specific questions in the future about anything you see about Venezuela, then I'm happy for Candy and Dan to share my contact. You're welcome to buzz me and ask me. We heard about this. What's actually going on? Is this true? Did this really happen? What's behind this story? No. But generally, it's about popular organisation. It's about yourselves as a pool of citizens forming a collective and doing all the political work which goes with this. Be it protests, be it challenging the media line, be it organising a delegation, be it collecting drugs to send as a solidarity offering to the Venezuelan organisations. Bear in mind that here in Venezuela, because of the economic situation, any sort of people-funded or people-organised political group here is struggling to purchase anything which they need for their political work, from a flagpole to a projector to anything like this. There are organisations which are setting up banks for solidarity donations of drugs and other goods, which are unpurchasable here in Venezuela due to the prices and so on. So anything like this is important, has an impact. No, don't think that if you make a $5 donation to Venezuela Analysis, this has no impact. No, everything like this has an impact on the level of political work which all of the collectives here in Venezuela, which receive these sorts of this sort of help, can do. No. And lastly, on social media, the battle on social media is ferocious. Social media, at least here in Venezuela, I'd imagine in the United States even more so, is heavily controlled by right-wing activists and bots, computers, and so on. So the work you can do on social media is important as well, to start challenging the sort of lies which are circulating and massifying, because this is the role of social media. It takes one lie and it starts massifying it through automated computer tweets or Facebook posts or whatever. And when it suddenly hits a certain thousand number of retweets or reposts, it becomes a truth. No? And this is a key part of the new way in which the media is starting to manipulate the reality in the minds of people in the rest of the world, no? As I talked to before, to justify future actions. So this is something which is invaluable for you to do, and something very simple as well. From any part of the world, you can help us here in Venezuela in this battle. Money which is being thrown at these regime change policies. The struggle today in Venezuela, the struggle for peace, not just in Venezuela, in the continent itself, is more important than it ever has been. The intensity of these efforts by Washington and the European Union and Canada have intensified over the last few years massively. Today, the struggle to impose peace, to defuse efforts to create a war in the continent, is a socialist policy, it's a socialist objective, it's a people's objective, no? And it's something we have to be fighting for, and this is where we all come in our day-to-day work as activists. But it shouldn't surprise us when we start seeing all these amounts of money used for Venezuela. It shouldn't surprise us when we see that this money has been squandered, robbed, spent on anything other than what it was meant to be spent on. No? And we can expect more of this for 2020. So when you see later on in the year, because it's bound to happen, the Pentagon releasing a certain amount of money to support so-and-so here in Venezuela because, they're democratic, although they've never been elected into anything, because they're a man of the people, despite the fact they've never really been to a popular sector of the country. This is the way that imperialism works, and we have to understand this to be able to counter it. So one of your jobs as American citizens is to denounce this, in your communities, in your organizations, to say, listen, this is our money, this is taxpayers' money, look where it's gone. Couldn't this have been better spent on hospitals, on roadways, on poverty reduction, and these sorts of issues? Probably. No? And this is where the international solidarity comes in as well. Okay, these issues are internationally related. Just as globalization is internationalist, so should be these sorts of issues. Okay, so it really doesn't surprise me, the Venezuelan Act. Expect more of the same, until of course you manage to change the government in the White House.
Okay, before we say goodbye, would you like to talk about the Venezuela Analysis donation drive that's currently going on?
Sure, yeah. Is there one more question? Do we have time?
Yes.
Oh.
You already asked a question, but yeah, you already asked a question. We need to be respectful of Paul's time. Could you talk?
If it's quick, I don't mind. I'll just do the plug quickly. So obviously the Venezuela Analysis is Venezuela's only English language progressive news portal. Still, despite much talk from the government about setting one up, that hasn't happened. Independent news site which will offer you not only news about what's going on in the progressive communities here in Venezuela, but also certainly critical perspective of what's going on in the government level from a left-wing perspective. We're based here in Venezuela. We are subject to everything that's going on here in Venezuela. We're not special. We don't live above everyone else. We suffer power cuts as everyone else does. We suffer water shortages as everyone else does. Our internet comes and goes like it does for everyone else in Venezuela. Our wages aren't enough to pay for food as for most Venezuelans. So we are dependent on support from our readership to keep the project going, basically. We have a number of full-time staff members dedicated to this. I'm one. You'll probably recognize the names of the other ones as soon as you hook into VenezuelaAnalysis.com. So we have an annual fundraising drive every year. We have about another week or so left of ours open. You can donate by PayPal, by check, by bank transfer, by a whole range of other methods. Everything is useful: $1, $0.50, $2, whatever you can manage. Just pop on to VenezuelaAnalysis.com and you'll easily find how to donate if you can support us in any way, shape, or form. Okay, it's very important.
Well, let me have to ask one quick question.
Okay, briefly.
Okay, my friend in Colombia, like BFF in Colombia, told me about how the 7.6 million Colombian refugees who have fled to Venezuela due to basically the situation, the capitalist situation in Venezuela, where the water is being privatized or being destroyed by coal mining companies, where basically the wages aren't enough to be able to eat. There's like 11,000 political prisoners in Colombia. 7.6 million have fled to Venezuela, and in a way it can be hard due to Colombian forces supported by the U.S. that are basically going in trying to meddle. So it makes it harder for these refugees, but they have to get out of Colombia because it's really aggressive in Colombia. There's 7.6 million
So
refugees. I would like this.
Are you still? Can we still hear you, Paul? Or can you still hear us?
We might get him back, but I think we might have lost him.
Oh,
Right now.
okay. Well, at least it was at the end.
Let's.
Yeah.
It's not looking good.
Okay. Yeah. Good, Kathy, can you hear me? Lynn, I know you wanted to make some announcements. You want to come up here briefly?
Thank you. Yeah, there's two new coalitions that have sprung up in Portland as a result of international coalitions. One is the Sanctions Kill Coalition, and we're trying to organize an event for March 13th, 14th, or 15th. We haven't really narrowed it down as to what it's going to be, but it's part of international actions that are taking place to prevent sanctions, the new form of a war. And they're endorsing this event that's happening next week, which is also an international coalition. And here in Portland, we want to have a demonstration on the 25th. It's No War on Iran. And so it'd be great to get involved with helping to organize these coalitions and also to go to the events. So the leaflets are up there at the table. Thank you.
And this is a national. This is gonna. There's gonna be actions all over the nation on
Yes.
this day, right?
Yes, on both those days.
Mhm.
So the 25th and then in March, and we'll tell you more about it then. Thanks.
There are people protesting in different countries too. It's not only out in the US.
Yes,
Mhm.
international.
International.
All around the world.
It's exciting because, we would like to concentrate the efforts in Portland, the anti-war efforts, just like it's being done internationally, to have people come together with all these groups and do big, massive things. Yeah, that's a goal for people starting these coalitions.
Yeah. Just to kind of speak on it a little bit more too, like the
What's the point of it?
the Imperial Project affects so many other aspects of our organizing. It affects our organizing around the environment. It affects our organizing around poverty here in the U.S. Like, all of these issues are intertwined. So it's really time, I think, in 2020 for us to step up and show up and start to put an end to this. So, yeah. I don't know what else is there to say.
No,
I think that's it. I want to thank everybody for coming out. We were going to have William Kamakaro, but he got into a surprise meeting with the mayor in Caracas. He's still down in Caracas. He's not back in the U.S. yet. So he kind of messaged us. He's like, I'm so sorry. But we were also having connection issues, so we weren't very surprised. But thanks for coming out and listening to Paul. And if you want to get more involved, please speak to any of us. Sign up for the newsletter. We can stay in touch by that. And thank you.
Thanks for helping.